Hey, this is Language Shrimp. Today we're talking about phonological tone. First, we're going to talk about what tone is and the types of tone when it comes to phonology. Then we're going to go over a bunch of different ways languages have developed different tone systems. Then finish with some changes you can put in your tone systems once you have them. So, tone in linguistics is when you use relative pitch and pitch contours to phonologically differentiate between words. It's sometimes described as singing words. However, keep in mind the pitch in tonal languages is always relative. It's not like a word will specifically be in F sharp or something. The classic example to blow the minds of those who speak non-tonal languages are the words ma, 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 ma in Mandarin Chinese, which I definitely butchered, but should translate to mother, hemp, horse, and to scold, respectively. These words all have the same consonants and vowels, differentiated solely by tone, but obviously have very different, unrelated meanings. They would definitely sound similar to a Chinese speaker, but the differences would be easily recognizable. Tone is actually found in many, many languages. Some even say a majority of languages. But it's very hard to solidly count due to the fact that some languages really ride the line between tonal and not. And more importantly, tonal languages are often concentrated in areas where we don't have much data. Wallace says about 42%, but even the researcher behind this number says they believe it's an underestimate. Now, when it comes to tone, the way you categorize them is very different from the likes of consonants and vowels. Because of how fluid and relative tone is, I'd argue no two languages have an identical tone sound or toneme, or even any two speakers. Because it's all relative, unlike the likes of consonants where you can plainly say, oh yeah, these two people are making the same tongue movements, and vowels where you can say, these two people's tongues are in the same area. But you can of course still categorize. There are two important distinctions within tone, register and contour. Register is essentially how high or low in pitch the tone is relatively. Most languages with tone register systems make a simple distinction between high register and low register, but sometimes you get a mid-register or even 4 to 5 registers. Notably, register is a fair bit more common than contour because it's generally simpler and also has more ways to develop, which I'll get into later. Contours are more so how your pitch changes within the bounds of a tone, with there usually being the likes of level, where your pitch stays mostly the same, falling, where the pitch falls, and rising, where it rises. However, you can also sometimes get things like dipping, where your pitch falls then rises, and peaking, where it rises then falls. Some languages also combine these concepts, where a tone is composed of both a register and a contour, accounting for both relative pitch and change in pitch at once, with the likes of high falling, low rising, high rising, and so on. Although these complex tone systems can get really shifty and have unpredictable actual results, and many will simplify into complex contours like dipping and peaking. Some systems may also have separate register and contour tones, like a high tone, a low tone, and a falling and/or rising tone. Now onto the development of tones, or tonogenesis. Before I get into examples, I have to talk about a concept called voice quality. This is essentially adding something to the way you voice your sounds. The reason I want to talk about these is that most tone come from some sort of sound change resulting in the voice quality of a syllable's vowel changing. Then this quality is what becomes the tone itself, and quite often it can stay as an aspect of the tone. So first, there are two big types, breathy voice, ah, and creaky voice, ah, which contrasts with modal voice, ah, which is essentially normal. These are found in full in Jalapa Mazatec and Ayak. In Ayak, these three qualities don't really have tone associations, but in Jalapa Mazatec, they are sometimes considered to be low, high, and mid-register, respectively. In most languages where they develop, though, they tend to immediately shift to tone, although often the quality stays attached to the tone in some way. Then, there is also the tense or stiff voice, ah, which isn't really like the others in that it doesn't stand alone in vowels in any languages, as far as I know, and is pretty much an immediate precursor to tone, essentially being synonymous with the high tone. Now, the way these convert into tone is very, very dependent on the order in which different voices emerged and transformed into tone. And all of these voices can be used to develop either tone registers or tone contours, although usually not both at the same time. I'll go through what each of these voices typically prefer being, though. Modal voice. This voice I wouldn't say has a preferred register. It typically just takes the opposite register as whatever tone develops before it. If tense is the first tone, it will develop high, in which case modal will go low. If breathy or creaky comes first, then they will usually go low, thus modal high. If there are multiple registers, then modal will generally be mid, maybe even forcing voices that usually result in low tones up to high tones, so that the modal voice can take the role of mid-tone. As for contour, modal is almost always level. Breathy voice. This voice prefers having a low register and a falling contour. Creaky voice. This voice generally prefers having a low register, but if breathy already took that, it may go high. For contour, though, it is incredibly inconsistent. I've seen falling and rising and even dipping occurring naturally with it, without other tone splits coming first, which is usually required for those more complex contours. Tense or stiff voice. This voice will always, as far as I've seen, take high register if in a register system, and generally prefers a rising contour, with some exceptions. There are also some other niche voices, like the glottalized or interrupted voice, which is effectively where you add a slight glottal stop in the middle of the syllable. It seems to have similar effects to the creaky voice, although it seems a bit more inclined to go high. And the slack voice, which is pretty much just a less aspirated breathy voice, with similar effects, and is sort of the equal opposite of the tense voice. Hence both the breathy/slack and tense/stiff voices being so strongly associated with their specific registers and contours. Now, the next question is, if tones are reflexes of voice qualities, then how do these qualities emerge? And there are two main ones. There's Onset Tonogenesis and Coda Tonogenesis, plus some weird ones I'll get into later. For onset, the way you typically see it happen is a voiced-voiceless consonant distinction transitions into a binary low-high tone distinction. Typically, a voiced consonant will cause the following vowel to become breathy or slack-voiced, and thus low tone, which in turn causes the modal voice to be high tone. Or inversely, the voiceless consonant may create a tense voice and high tone, resulting in the modal having a low tone. This mostly has the same result in the end, with the exception of neutral syllables with either no consonant onset or a sonorant onset, which will go with whatever the modal voice tone ends up being. This kind of thing is happening right now in the Afrikaans language. You may also see other consonant distinctions result in tone as well. Aspiration can go either way, creating a breathy or tense voice and the corresponding tone. The Karen language has a three-way consonant split between aspirated, voiceless, and voiced, which resulted in a high, mid, and low register respectively. Many languages may also have similar three-way distinctions, but only collapse one of them, such as an aspirated, voiceless, voiced system becoming an aspirated high, tenuous low system. Punjabi has a very interesting system that is sort of a mix of onset and coda, where it had a breathy voiced consonant series that merged with the aspirated series, but left behind a low tone on vowels after the breathy consonant, but a high tone on vowels before. Do also note that generally you only get register tones from onsets as a rule of thumb, because contour tones need to have very specific coda conditions to occur, which are of course provided by coda-motivated tonogenesis. Speaking of which, onto coda-based tonogenesis. While onsets usually only result in different registers, codas can go in either the register or contour direction, usually not both at the same time though. Both types can come from a similar process though, the transition of debocalization to voice quality distinctions to tone. As a reminder from my consonants video, debocalization is essentially when consonants lose their place of articulation in certain situations, becoming glottal versions of themselves. Typically, this looks like fricatives becoming the glottal fricative ha, and plosives becoming the glottal stop ah. These glottal consonants are then very easily lost and will often leave voice quality in their place. The glottal fricative resulting in the breathy voice, and the glottal stop resulting in either the creaky or tense voice. The Sino-Tibetan languages and many other nearby East and Southeast Asian languages had this occur, although many also still had their checked syllables, which had normal plosive consonants at the end that resulted in the tense voice. In some languages, these final consonants were lost, just like their debocalized cousins, but in many they actually weren't, meaning these languages do actually have contour tones and final plosives, but these final plosives are tied directly to a specific tone. Overall, the result is these languages actually employed all four voices. In Old Chinese, the modal voice, derived from open syllables and sonorant ending syllables, created a level tone. The creaky voice, derived from the glottal stop, created a dipping tone. The breathy voice, derived from the glottal fricative, created a falling tone. And the tense voice, derived from checked syllables, created a rising tone. Many languages did this differently, though. In Vietnamese, the glottal stop was treated the same as other plosives and given the tense voice. Meanwhile, in Tai Dam, the glottal fricative was treated the same as the checked syllables, and it got the rising tone, while the glottal stop and the creaky voice got falling. The former merger of glottal stop and checked syllable is more common, though. Tai-Dam is the only language I know where the glottal fricative merged instead. Burmese is really interesting, with the modal voice actually becoming a rising tone, the creaky and breathy voice both being high-falling, mainly being differentiated by voice quality still, and the tense voice being a high-level or falling tone. And while it originally came from checked syllables, it has since undergone debocalization, now always being followed by a glottal stop. As for register distinctions derived from the coda, they similarly typically come from final consonants debocalizing, then getting lost in favor of voice quality. However, registers are usually much less flexible and diverse than contours, usually being restricted to the high-low binary distinction, usually being caused by one of the three weird voices developing and taking their preferred register and the modal voice taking the other. Something very interesting about this, though, is while fricative codas pretty much always lead to breathy voice and thus low tone, the glottal stop and other plosives can lead to either the tense or creaky voice and thus either the high or low tone. This has led to both the Athabascan and Bantu languages having mirror tone systems within the same language family. In the Athabascan languages, ejective consonants were the main triggers of tonogenesis. In southern Athabascan languages, these consonants created a creaky voice on the preceding vowels, and thus a low tone, with the modal consonants becoming high tone. While in northern Athabascan languages, these consonants created a tense voice and high tone, with the modal voice becoming low tone, meaning the same words in the Proto-Lang had completely opposite tones in the different branches of the family. Also, while debocalization and consonant loss through it is usually very necessary for contour tones to develop, it's less so for register tones. Languages like Kikipo and Hopi had a merger of pre-aspirated and tenuous stops, and the coda result in a breathy, modal, low-high distinction, with Kikipo also having its regular fricatives condition the breathy tone. In the example I just mentioned above, in the Athabascan languages, involved a consonant merger of ejectives and normal plosives. By the way, I realize I haven't really touched on pre-aspirated stops before, but they are essentially a reflex of final aspirated stops, where the aspiration moves before the stop itself. If you want to see an atonal example of this, it's found in Scottish Gaelic. Now, I mentioned earlier how some languages simultaneously have both tone contours and tone registers. This mainly happens through what is called a tone split. Essentially, first, a language will develop a debocalization-based tone contour system, followed by an onset voicing-based register distinction. Notably, the inverse also does occur sometimes, where registers develop first, followed by contours, but this is less common. This sound change is basically the sound change across most of mainland East and Southeast Asia, with mainly Burmese and Mandarin as the exceptions. Although it is also found in languages outside of this area and is likely a contributing factor to the insane 10-plus tone systems of the Oto-Manguean languages, which I'll get into later. These systems, though, never work out as simply as they seem they would. Seemingly, once you get this complicated with tone, the sound changes start getting extremely random and counterintuitive. Here's a bunch of examples including White Hmong, Vietnamese, Tai-Dam, and a bunch of Chinese languages. I'm going to refer to these tones by their letter-number pairings, with A meaning the tone originated from an open syllable, B meaning it originated from a syllable ending in a glottal stop, C from a syllable ending in the glottal fricative, and D from a checked syllable, with 1 referring to tones originating from voiceless plosives and 2 from voiced. In White Hmong, it seems like the tone split was effectively a second contour split, with the originally level A tones becoming rising and falling based on register, the B1 and C2 tones having expected results, and the B2 and C1 tones flattening out. Notably, the checked D tones did not experience a tone split, which I've also seen occur in Cantonese. White Hmong also maintained its breathy and creaky voice quality distinctions in its C2 and D tones, and is one of the only languages I've seen where the glottal stop seemingly was correlated with a tense voice and checked syllables with a creaky voice. Vietnamese is extremely inconsistent. I'm not even going to talk about the A and B tones, because Vietnamese C tones are the most egregious example of counterintuitive tone shifts I've seen. The C1 tone is interestingly low-falling, despite being in the supposed higher register, while what should be a low-falling breathy tone in the C2 slot is actually a high-rising tone that in many dialects has a glottalized voice. Tai-Dam is probably the most normal of the set, despite its weird merging I mentioned earlier of the B glottal fricative and D checked series. Although even it is imperfect, with its B2 tone flattening out into a level tone lower than its A2 tone, And it took me a sec to notice, but its A1 and C1 tones are seemingly lower than its A2 and C2 tones. And now I'm really curious if that's a mistake on the table or something weirder. And I'm not going to go over all these Chinese languages, other than that none of them are the ideal tone split system either, and that some of them show how complex contours can result from a tone split system. If you want more examples of complex contours deriving from this change, many dialects of Hmong and Vietnamese I didn't show contain them. Because another thing about the inconsistency of complex tone systems is that they are often very inconsistent even within dialects of the same language. Okay, now onto some more niche tone origins. The U in Cheyenne supposedly had a vowel length distinction, which became a register distinction, with long vowels becoming high and short vowels low. Many Nordic and Tibetan languages had prosodic or stress-motivated tone formation, which makes sense because oftentimes a high or rising tone is an innate component of stress, called a pitch accent. In Hmong War, the final syllable is always stressed, resulting in a drastically rising tone, contrasting with the generally high, unstressed tone. And most coda consonants are restricted. So, when they borrow a word with a restricted coda consonant, they epenthesize a new vowel onto the end and give it a unique low rising tone, keeping the rising contour at the end of the word, but laxing the vowel that shouldn't exist, causing the usually high, unstressed syllable before to become falling to reach the new low tone. Swedish, one of the only Indo-European languages to develop tone, contains one of the weirdest tone systems ever. Notably, Swedish contains tone across a word instead of a syllable. This isn't unique to Swedish, and I'll get to the concept in a bit, but it is rarer than the alternative. The believed origin of Swedish tone is similar in concept to Manguar, minus the borrowing, where whenever an epenthetic vowel or affix turned a monosyllabic word into a disyllabic word, the pitch of the word final stress remained on what used to be the final syllable, resulting in a different pattern, meaning tone 1, often called the acute accent, originated from words with an initial pitch accent, becoming falling tone throughout the word, while tone 2, often called the grave accent, happened in cases where the pitch accent remained at the end of the word and is more of a dipping tone across the word. Now, we do need to talk also in a broader sense about the relations between tone and prosody. As I mentioned, in many languages, a high register or rising contour is often part of what makes a stressed word stressed. But in many languages, tone itself is a sign of a stressed syllable, and unstressed syllables actively don't have tone. Most of the East and Southeast languages I've mentioned sustain their complex tones in part by restricting words to only one effective syllable, with disyllabic words being rare and often compound words. However, many either do have or have had what is called a minor syllable, major syllable dichotomy, where a word either contained one full syllable, tone and all, or a full tone syllable preceded by a heavily reduced minor syllable. These minor syllables were, of course, atonal, but also typically were only composed of an initial consonant and the schwa, not even distinguishing vowels in many languages like Vietnamese and Khmer. Though in many languages these syllables have been lost, and Khmer has lost its tone system anyways, though it did get some sick consonant clusters from the loss of minor syllable vowels. Notably, in Vietnamese, while the contour of a tone was determined by the major syllable's coda, the register split was actually motivated by the voicing of the consonant of the minor syllable before it was lost, leading to many initial consonants that would normally have only been able to exist alongside one register now being able to exist with both. Less extreme examples also exist, where tone either never developed in unstressed vowels or was lost in them. Often, unstressed syllables are then considered to have the unstressed tone, and it is also common for more complex tones to only exist in stressed syllables, or for stressed syllables to have a wider variety of tones in general. Related to this, there's also the idea of syllable-bound tones versus word-bound tones. I already mentioned how Swedish's tones occur across a word instead of in a specific syllable, but this is not limited to Swedish. Shanghainese has a really interesting system I'll get into in a sec. Notably, the Bantu languages typically have very simple syllable-bound high-low register systems. But in some languages, these tones sort of smooth or blend together within the word. So a disyllabic word containing a low tone followed by a high tone may become one word-bound rising tone. If this is then followed by syncope of one of the vowels, this may then lead the remaining vowel now solely carrying a new contour tone, in a change I like to call tone clustering, because it's literally forcing tones together within the same syllable. But I don't know if there's an official term for it. Tone clustering also notably doesn't have to result in a word-bound tone, instead simply blending the tones of what were two syllables into one. This is how you typically get those simple tone systems with both registers and contours that don't overlap that I mentioned earlier. Like a language starts with a high-low distinction, but syncope merges two syllables, so in these merged, likely stressed syllables, there are now 4 tones between high, low, rising, and falling. The reason you often only see one contour, rising or falling, though, is due to certain sound changes I'll get into later. Now, I knew in this video I'd have to talk about one specific language family, the Oto-Manguean languages. These guys are known for having the most extreme tone systems of any family by far, and they aren't all the same crazy tone system either. It's a very diverse family that just seems to keep developing wild, unique tone systems. It's notably the biggest home of the languages I mentioned that have 4 to 5 register tones, such as Usila Chinatec, although it's more commonly known for languages like Quipote Chinatec, which are sometimes cited as having over 19 tones, which is of course the extreme example, but while in East Asia the tone limit is usually 8 to rarely 10 tones, 9 to 12 tones isn't that hard to come by amongst Oto-Manguean languages. This is because of the aforementioned more typical registers per language, and more notably, the fact that many of these languages developed both complex contour register splits similar to East Asian languages and tone clustering. While I wish I could give you a rundown of what specific tones resulted from specific tone splits and clusters, sadly there just is not enough research on Oto-Manguean languages, or these tone systems are too unpredictable to trace back in specifics, especially since tones are believed to have been around in Oto-Manguean for up to 6,000 years. While I found multiple papers explaining different massive tone systems, in which tones can go where and how they affect each other, I couldn't find a trace of specific phonological changes in a specific language. The closest thing to something that shows how a system like this would theoretically evolve is a description of tones in the Yolo-Shachital Mixtec, which seemingly hasn't clustered its tones yet, but has very specific rules for how you put together its base tones, resulting in 20 possible pairs of tones within a word that could very easily, and probably will eventually, evolve into a more true near 20 tone system. Oh, and one final footnote I had to include, that I only found late into making this video. The way many Chinatec and Amuzgo languages have 5 registers, despite there only being 4 major voices, is because there is actually a whole other voice exclusive to some Oto-Manguean languages, the ballistic voice or ballistic syllable, which is almost like a more tense voice that is capable of existing on its own, like the breathy and creaky voice. Wikipedia describes it as, quote, a fortis release of the consonant, a gradual surge in the intensity of a vowel, followed by a rapid decay in intensity into post-vocalic aspiration, and it typically results in the highest tone, with tense voice getting mid-high. And since it's described as losing intensity as you say it, it might theoretically result in a falling or even peaking contour in a contour system, but I don't think that's happened in the real world yet. Oh, and here's some visualized examples of various Oto-Manguean tone systems. Okay, we're almost done now. So I've talked extensively about how one can build a tone system, but now let's get into what you can do once you have one. Mainly, tone sandhi. Tone sandhi is essentially how tones affect each other, just like how most sound changes describe how vowels and consonants affect each other. Notably, due to the weird relations tones have with word boundaries, sandhi often moves through word boundaries. In fact, I've mentioned sandhi before as literally meaning a sound change that goes through word boundaries. Sadly, similarly to how inconsistent tonemes themselves can be, and their changes on their own, the ways they affect each other are similarly often unpredictable. In fact, the randomness of tone changes is what makes tone sandhi unpredictable in the first place, is typically the tones you see won't be the same as they were when the sandhi rule solidified. However, there are a few general patterns. Tone terracing. This is a pattern generally found in West Africa, where generally higher tones tend to fall in pitch throughout a word or phrase, often turning into mid-register than low-register equivalents. Often, these downsteps are also caused by low tones themselves, which generally maintain the same pronunciation throughout a word or phrase. There's also a unique variant of this called Meyersen's rule, where a high tone forces a following high tone to downstep. Heightening assimilation. This isn't really a named rule, but just a thing I've seen a lot where high tones raise nearby tones. This can occur before or after the high tone, and will often be used in 3-register systems, shifting low tones to mid and mid to high. If these upsteps occur after the high tone, they may result in effectively the opposite of tone terracing. Generally, the commonness of tone terracing and this sound change play a big part in why simple tone clustering often results in only one contour between rising and falling, as if low tone triggered tone terracing was active in a simple high-low system before the clustering, then no syllable pairs can form a rising tone. If high tones assimilated low tones before them, rising pairs are impossible yet again, and if they assimilated low tones after them, then falling tone pairs become impossible. The obligatory contour principle. This is essentially that repeated tone contours don't like being together, especially complicated ones. Mandarin Chinese has a lot of examples of this, although its Sandhi isn't really strictly phonological, more so occurring on a phrase-by-phrase basis. In Mandarin, if two dipping tones are in a row, then the first one will often become a falling tone. If two rising tones are in a row, the first will often become a dipping or falling tone. And if two falling tones are in a row, the first may become a level tone. Tone spreading. This is kind of a version of what I mentioned earlier, where a syllable-bound tone effectively becomes word-bound. Although the thing that makes it Sandhi is that it effectively makes the tone phrase-bound, as the tone spreads across word boundaries. Shanghainese has two tone Sandhi systems, one of which is a perfect tone spreading example, but I'm also going to talk about the other one here too. It has its left dominant system, which essentially has the first tone of the phrase spread across multiple syllables, with the specific tones being based on the number of syllables in the phrase and the original tone. So the high falling tone in a two-syllable phrase manifests as a high level tone followed by a low falling tone. And it has its right dominant system, where all tones except for the last in the phrase become level tones of different registers corresponding to the underlying register of the tone. So an originally high falling tone would become high level, and an originally low falling tone would become low level. What determines which system you use is mostly grammatical. For example, noun-adjective phrases use left-bound Sandhi, and verb-adverb phrases use right-bound Sandhi. And most words in their base form default to left-bound Sandhi, so that they have one unified tone. Tone circles. These aren't really a rule, just something that happens in super complex tone systems, mainly in Hmong and many Chinese languages, such as Taiwanese Hokkien. Essentially, and I'm going to massively oversimplify here, the system is filled with exceptions. In Taiwanese, only syllables found at the end of the phrase and certain common particles actually have their real citation tone. From there are complicated rules for which tone manifests as what in all other situations. Typically, the tone will undergo normal Sandhi, where it moves one step on this circle. So a 1 tone would become a 7 tone, a 4 tone ending in p, t, or k would become an 8 tone, while a 4 tone ending in a glottal stop would become a 2, and a 5 would become a 7 in southern dialects or a 3 in northern dialects. There are also separate Sandhi systems, such as double Sandhi, where you move 2 steps along the circle, triple Sandhi, and a specific Sandhi system for syllables with the particle a. Now, I would explain the rules of thumb for what determines which tones Sandhi into what, and which exceptions there are, but there aren't really enough rules of thumb to look to. The system probably made a lot of sense when it first evolved, but all the tones have shifted since then, and some of the rules themselves have shifted also. Not to mention the dialectical variation. So, if you want to build a tone circle like this, or really any sort of tone Sandhi system, you have some pretty free range to just BS your way through. I stick to the general recommendations, though, that 1. Tone contours really like being dissimilatory, meaning they cause nearby identical contours to become different. 2. Tones typically fall or dip through a phrase, meaning higher registers and falling contours tend to like staying or forming near the front, and lower registers and rising contours tend to like staying or forming near the back. This also translates to falling tones in general being slightly more common than rising ones, and dipping tones being much more common than peaking ones. And 3. Unlike tone contours, tone registers may be, and often are, assimilatory, meaning tones make nearby tones more similar, but they can still sometimes be dissimilatory, such as with Meyusen's rule. I also want to mention for tone Sandhi, there are sometimes what are known as floating tones, which are tones that aren't really there but are treated like they are, causing Sandhi in nearby tones. For example, in Bambara, the definite article is a floating low tone. It isn't actually pronounced, but in Bambara, low tones cause following tones to be pronounced lower, so you can still tell where the floating tone is. This looks mostly like tone alternation used for grammar, which is not uncommon, by the way, and happens pretty much the same way any consonant or vowel assimilation systems turn into grammatical marking. But when floating tones are parts of words and affixes and the effects are more useful to analyze as phonological than grammatical, the term floating tone is useful. Also, keep in mind that while tone Sandhi is common, it's not really necessary, especially in a simple tone system, where it may actually be less likely than not. But even then, some complex tone systems like Vietnamese lack any real Sandhi too. And that should be all for this video. Thank you for watching.